Tough talk on China as the US Vice-President wraps up her visit to Singapore and heads to Vietnam. Kamala Harris has accused Beijing of intimidation in the region. For more, Assistant Professor Huang Chin-Hao joins us. He specializes in political science at Yale-NUS College. Professor Huang, tough talk by Kamala Harris on China, and now Beijing has snapped back as well. What will it take for both these countries to sit down at the same table, given the ever-escalating rhetoric?
Well, it's understandable that the United States would want to defend its position and be explicit about airing some of these concerns of the rapidly rising China that are seeking to challenge U.S. domain in this part of the world and elsewhere around the world. So that's understandable. Unfortunately, the tough talk and rhetoric that we're seeing are not actually conducive in helping both sides bridge the gap that is widening every day. We got fundamental issues that are at stake that require the collaboration of both sides, with a pandemic that's raging, disrupting societies and the global economy at unprecedented levels. The two largest economies in the world are still bickering about narrow self-interested issues. And so that is quite an unfortunate development that we're seeing.
Professor Huang, Kamala Harris reassured partners and allies in this region that the US wouldn't ask them to choose sides. But give us a reality check here. Is it even really possible for countries in this region not to side with either the US or China?
It's without a doubt that the vice president's trip to Singapore and to Vietnam after this, in some respects, is seen as a listening tour to keep America's finger on the pulse, so to speak, to seek regional leaders' perspectives, concerns, and priorities. I mean, the region knows full well about China's rise. They've seen it up close and personal for over 2 decades. This is not an overnight political phenomenon. And so what's less of a constant here is actually the U.S. commitment to the region. That has actually waxed and waned across different U.S. administrations. And so I think with this visit, it's a timely one, and I'm certain that the vice president heard loud and clear what Singapore and what Southeast Asian countries' interests are, particularly on the issue of not choosing sides.
Well, speaking of U.S. commitment, the U.S. and Singapore signed several agreements while Ms. Harris was here. What does that signal for the region?
I think it demonstrates the United States is making a tangible contribution to regional security, paying more attention to what is actually good for the region. It's also good for the United States and global security and stability. It's also an important signal, not just for Singapore, but to the region. Working with Singapore on pressing issues such as clean energy, tackling the climate crisis, as she calls it, managing the free flow of trade and minimizing supply chain disruptions, particularly in strategic sectors that Singapore has a competitive edge, like the semiconductor industry. All of these are very important issues, not just to Singapore, but to the region more broadly. And so I think it demonstrates very clearly U.S. resolve and ability to lead, and most important, to work with like-minded partners in a credible and tangible way.
And how deeply do you anticipate the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan is going to overshadow her Vietnam visit now, Professor? And will it detract from Washington's regional agenda?
Afghanistan will certainly cast a long and large shadow on the vice president's visit to Vietnam. But I think what's important, as she's highlighted in her speech this afternoon, is how to actually move and look ahead, specifically how to cede ground in a responsible manner in Afghanistan, closing a chapter in America's longest war abroad, and to try to salvage a bad situation from getting any worse.
And how do you sort of see that playing out then? US President Biden, can he really make a clean break in Afghanistan?
It'll be challenging. The security implications, I think, of Afghanistan is important and is highlighted in Vice President Harris's trip to Asia. As the U.S. exits, I think the larger question is this. Is the United States going to be a reflective power, one that better understands now the difficult lessons of nation building and not using its military prowess to try to solve every problem around the world? That's just not sustainable, and it's an extremely costly approach. It needs to understand that U.S. leadership and authority is multifaceted. It's not trying to rely excessively on military force from here on out, not least in Asia, where the spotlight of U.S. role and influence will become increasingly important and salient in the years ahead.
Oh, thank you so much for your thoughts this evening. Assistant Professor Huang Chin-Hao from Yale-NUS College.